Hello, intro students. All right. Oh, my memory card was full. So, my last lecture got cut off prematurely. What I was talking about, though, was the way that in the United States, there are different ways to respond to deviance and even to crime. In the United States, we tend to be very rational, but not very reasonable. We tend to be more autocratic and authoritarian in our approach, particularly to crime. And we tend to be very much punishment-centered. Whereas there are cross-cultural examples that we could look to of other ways that societies respond to deviance. Now keep in mind, if somebody is engaging in deviant acts or criminal acts, that's something they're doing, that's on them. How we respond as a society, though, our response is on us. So let's take a look at England, for example, and the specific example of dogging. It's partly because it's an interesting example and it's kind of funny what ended up happening there. So dogging is a particular British pastime. It's illegal in England to do this, but it's where you go to a public place like a public park and you have sex in that public place. And so this was becoming an issue with a lot of people complaining about all the people having sex in public places, and especially in parks. People think that if children see a naked body or somebody having sex, that I don't know, their brains will disintegrate or something, or evil spirits will fly into their heads. But anyways, there was an outcry to stop the dogging. So the British government at first or law enforcement, started putting up signs in parks asking people politely to please not have sex here. That worked about as well as you can imagine. Not at all. And people violated the signs quite regularly. If anything, that probably added a higher degree of desirability to the behavior. And so then they decided to do something else. Instead of banning people who wanted to engage in dogging from public spaces, they carved out social space for people who wanted to dog or engage in dogging within the larger public space. So in other words, socially speaking, they made room for them. So they put up a fence and gave a sizable portion, and they put up signs saying this is where people are engaging in dogging. If you do not want to see someone engaging in dogging or sexual public sex acts, do not go beyond the fence. That way, if anyone enters the fence, they know what they're getting themselves into. So that's a very different response. Keep in mind, public sex is illegal in England just like it's illegal here. But what would we do if that were happening here in the United States? We would arrest them. They would be on sex offender registries, especially a park. If children were around, they might end up getting the label of pedophile, end up going to prison for decades, and then have to go around for the rest of their life on the sex offenders registry. So they have to go door to door whenever they move to a new neighborhood and say, "Hi, I'm a sex offender. Do you have any objections to me living in this neighborhood?" And of course, everyone's going to say, "No, not at all," right? So, I hope by point of comparison you can see how different the societal responses are for this. Now, the strongest negative social sanction that we have in the United States is capital punishment, or the death penalty. And that ends up also illustrating, that's another point that illustrates how much more authoritarian we are with our sense of punishment than other countries, other industrialized countries. We're the only industrialized nation in the world that still practices the death penalty. And the other industrialized countries in the world kind of look down on us for that, seeing us as being kind of backwards for still practicing that. We also have a fairly high recidivism rate. Recidivism rates are the rate of prisoners who have been, they've served their time, they're released, and then they're rearrested. Recidivism rates being very high compared to other industrialized nations illustrates that prison is ultimately not a deterrent for crime, because nobody goes into committing a crime thinking they're going to get caught. Nobody goes into committing a crime thinking, I wonder how many years I'm going to get for this. Let's do a lottery. How many years do you think we'll get? How many years do you think we'll get? No, they go in thinking they're not going to get caught. So prison is not a deterrent. That's ideological and false as well. Now, in terms of the death penalty, many opponents of the death penalty actually point to the wave of exonerations that I referred to earlier in the 90s with DNA evidence being considered. In 49 of the 50 states, there was a halt to putting people to death, actually. And that was so DNA evidence could be determined. There was, I can't remember the exact statistic, but I think that it was somewhere around 9% of people who were on death row were found to have been innocent after taking into consideration DNA evidence. Actually, let me look that up real quick. Percentage of death row inmates who were exonerated by DNA evidence. And Google says they're giving total numbers. I don't want total numbers, I want the percentage. Okay, this is coming from an article published in 2014, the rate of false convictions of criminal defendants who are sentenced to death in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science of the United States of America. And they are citing .1%. 4.1%. So, oh wait. Oh, that's now. In the past, it was as high as 12%. So, I said 9%, which is kind of in the middle. It's lower today than it was in the past. In the past, it was up to 12%, though. That still means that there's a high number of people who are innocent who are being put to death. And the question that people who are opponents of death row end up asking is, if we're killing even one innocent person, is it worth it? Now, you may have noticed I said 49 out of 50 during the 90s and early 2000s stopped killing people in order to reopen cases to consider DNA evidence. The one state that didn't was Texas. Kept on going. Now, we also see that as there is a bias in terms of who's accused of committing a crime and who is convicted, as well as sentencing, to illustrate that point, the Supreme Court actually acknowledged it in 1972 that there is a provable, or was in 1972, racial bias in terms of who ended up being put on death row. And from 1972 to 1977, death row, the death penalty was declared unconstitutional. And then some states started to rewrite their laws to pass the Supreme Court's sniff test, so to speak, that they ended up putting into that case. That case again, Furman v. Georgia, 1972. And by 1978, the death penalty was continuing once again. Now, the Supreme Court found that there was extreme racial bias going on in terms of who was getting the death penalty. And does that mean that with the states rewriting their laws since 1977, that they got rid of the racial bias and who got the death penalty? No. Now, we can look at this in terms of representational statistics. So, for instance, white Americans make up about 63% of the U.S. population. However, the data I'm about to read to you, which is from your textbook, includes, or the data I'm about to read to you breaks it down by ethnicity as well as race. And so they include Latinos as a separate category. And so, in the U.S. population, we can see a percentage of whites on death row, 44%. Now, in 2010, the whites in the U.S. population numbered at 67%. It's about 62 to 63% today. That 44% on death row is statistics from 2010. African Americans, about 13% of the population in 2010. Still currently about 13% of the population today, make up about 41% of prisoners on death row. So get that, 13% of the population, 41% of prisoners on death row. Not representational at all. Now, if race didn't matter whatsoever, and all things were equal across race and ethnicity, you would expect equal statistical representation across all things. So you would expect equal representations, statistically speaking, in terms of the number of people in prisons. You would expect equal representation in terms of Congress, in terms of the number of presidents, in terms of the numbers of doctors, lawyers, dentists, professors, what have you. So you would find, if all things were equal, an equal representation across things that are looked at positively and negatively by the society. So this is clearly not representational, especially when you consider that we know that criminal activity is diffuse across racial and ethnic populations. Latinos in 2010 made up 14% of the population. It's a bit higher today, 12% on death row. So slightly representational there, actually a little bit lower in terms of representation. Asian Americans, 1% on death row, 4% U.S. population. Asian Americans, another population that has grown. Native Americans make up 1% in the U.S. population, 1% on death row. Representational there. But that is actually shrinking. Native Americans are still dying off, largely due to poverty and the effects of poverty. And so already a small group within American society due to the history of colonization and westward expansion and imperialism, but also a group that continues to dwindle in our population. All right. Now, I want to add a discussion. You may have noticed on Blackboard that I added a chapter from a book. Now, this book was published in 2008, and so the statistics are a bit dated. However, I added it to Blackboard for you to read because it's quickly becoming a classic. And it's written by Jeffrey Ryman and Paul Lee. And it's quickly just becoming a classic statement in criminal justice and criminology, particularly of the conflict theory perspective. Though they do combine structural functionalism, as we'll see. What they're doing here in the first chapter is laying out the evidence for a theoretical argument that we're going to get to at the end that is actually combining multiple theoretical perspectives into one. And so I kind of mischaracterized it saying it just comes from the conflict perspective. That's not true at all, though conflict was certainly an influence on them. So the book is called The Rich Get Richer, The Poor Get Prison. And as I said, written by Jeffrey Ryman and Paul Lee. So they argue, starting out, that our criminal justice system is designed to fail. And part of this can be demonstrated by looking at political rhetoric. So politicians, when it comes to crime, engage in a logical fallacy that's known as a tautology. Tautology, it's Tautology, tautology. A tautology is kind of like circular reasoning, but it's any kind of logic system that you set up where no matter what you input, no matter what data you input, the logic system itself will spit out the same answer. So American politics, when it comes to crime, works tautologically. So, and this is across the aisle. I'm not being partisan here. You see this with Republicans, you see it with Democrats, you see it with independents, you see it across the board. So, I'm just talking about American political rhetoric in general. So, crime was down in the 90s, but anytime you say something like that, you're immediately comparing it to something. So what are you comparing it to? Well, you can only say crime was down in the 90s if you're comparing crime in the 90s to the 1980s. Crime did go down. However, if you were comparing crime in the 90s to the 1960s, crime was through the roof in the 90s compared to the 60s. Now, keep in mind also that in the 60s, we only locked up violent offenders. We didn't lock up nonviolent drug offenders. And so part of why the crime rate went so high in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was in large parts due to the war on drugs. Another part of political rhetoric. Now, Bill Clinton, when he was president, takes credit for crime going down in the 90s as compared to the 80s because he had signed a crimes bill in 94 that put 20,000 more police on the streets. But that cannot possibly explain the decrease in the crime rate because all you have to do is the math. We got 50 states. He added 20,000 police officers nationally for the whole country. It takes 5 police officers to keep one area to walk, the beat, so to speak, and keep one area under surveillance or an officer in the area for 24 hours a day. So it's broken up typically by 5 shifts. So when you consider that it takes 5 officers to police one area for 24 hours in a given day, then Clinton only added 4,000 more officers to the entire country, which 4,000 people cannot possibly explain the drop in the crime rate. Actually, it's better explained by the boom in the economy that was occurring due to Silicon Valley and the dot-com industry that, as we also know from economic history, was doomed to bust eventually. Now, all of this ends up leading, though, for politicians to say the same thing no matter what happens. If the crime rate goes up, they say, aha, we need more police, more prisons. If the crime rate stays the same, they say, we need it to go down, so more police, more prisons. If the crime rate goes down, they say, aha, it's working, so you know what we need? More police, more prisons. So no matter what happens with the crime rates, politicians say, more police, more prisons. All right. So, what does this kind of thinking lead to? Well, just between 1980 and 2007, the number of Americans in prison, just in prison, went from 329,000 to 1.6 million. In 2007, if all people, keep in mind the book's a little dated, so their data is a little dated, but actually this is the same number today as it was in 2007. So that's a positive, it's not gone up beyond this. But in 2007, if you count all people behind bars, you're talking about 2.3 million people. So whether it's 2007 or 2020, that's still a lot of people you're talking about. Between 1969 and 1999, the incarcerated population increased by 700%. In sociology, we refer to that as the incarceration binge. And the incarceration binge had very little to do with the crime rate in the 90s. It did have something to do, because if you are locking away people who are committing crimes, then what happens, though, is you start getting diminishing returns, because you'll pick up the habitual people who engage in criminal acts. And then after that, you're just getting first-time offenders, really. And so if you take that into consideration, then the incarceration binge, once you get habitual criminal people who habitually commit crimes off the streets, then you're looking at it only affecting the crime rate between 10 to 27% total. That's it. And so it cannot explain the sudden drop in the crime rate of the 1990s. So why would we say 10 to 27%? Well, like I said, diminishing returns, but also because prison, the conditions of prison will tend to increase the likelihood of violent crime for non-violent criminals. So say somebody's picked up on a non-violent drug charge, and they're put in prison with violent people who have committed violent crimes and who are still engaging in violent acts. And then they are victims of the nonviolent offenders, are victims of violence, being beaten, being forced to join gangs for safety, being raped on a regular basis. There's what's referred to as a brutalization effect. And so people end up becoming, people who are brutalized end up becoming more brutal themselves and more violent themselves. And so when they are finally released, they are more likely to commit violent crimes, especially if they can't find a job because of having a criminal record. We also see this ends up being a mental health issue, because people who are beaten and raped on a regular basis, or have to live in an environment where those are common occurrences, surprise, come out with mental health issues. And so that also makes it more likely that they're going to engage in a deviant act of some sort. We also see the parole system. Now, the parole system is also a big part of the recidivism rate, because 66% of the people who go back into prison, so 66% of the recidivism rate is by people for parole violations, not because they've committed another crime. And so being out of prison but on parole makes it very difficult to find a job, very difficult to find a home, very difficult to make ends meet in general. And then it's also difficult to meet every demand of your parole officer, which could include things like not associating with people who have criminal records themselves. And as we talked about when we were discussing Edmund Sutherland, 50% of people in prison have friends and family members who are mainly family members who are in prison themselves. So part of your parole is you can't talk to your friends and family. All right. Now, we also see part of this is economics. Many of the prisoners who have been locked up during the incarceration binge, as I said, have been for nonviolent drug offenses. So this is also just supply-demand economics. A lot of the illegal drugs are being run by criminal organizations, sometimes with backing from other corporations, like the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, and the meth epidemic. But aside from that, if you're locking up people who are selling drugs, then that just creates a new economic opportunity for someone else to step in to sell drugs in that area. So you're not getting drugs off the street, you're just creating economic opportunities for new drug dealers. And that's indeed what we see. As long as there's a demand for the drugs, there will be people who will want to profit on supplying the drugs. That's capitalism in a nutshell. Well, that's an aspect of capitalism. Just an aspect. We also see another effect. Organized crime or criminal organizations start to recruit at younger and younger ages. So if kids are caught selling drugs, then they're going to be going into the juvenile system. And they're more likely to be released sooner while they're still juveniles, so they can be reused by the criminal organization. And when they, or if they age out, then their records are sealed at the age of 18. But there's another aspect to this as well. If kids are selling drugs, I mean, people are going to sell drugs to people they know. And who do kids know the most of? Other kids. So the more the criminal organizations are trying to meet this demand for a supply of drugs, and the more the adults are being picked up and locked away for decades, the more they're going to use kids, and the more likely the kids are going to sell to other kids. Matter of fact, it's easier. I remember reading a study years ago. It was easier in New York City for kids to get their hands on heroin than alcohol. The reason is that a drug dealer doesn't ask for IDs. So you go into a liquor store as a kid, you're immediately kicked out. But a drug dealer, as long as you can pay for the drugs, that's all they care about. So we see, in general, incarceration only worsens the conditions that lead to crime. So in part, the incarceration binge is increasing crime rates. And it's not an accident that crime rates suddenly started going through the roof when the war on drugs was instituted. So, David Garland is a highly respected researcher in criminology and criminal justice. And he makes the argument that prisons can only be seen as a failure if you believe that they are meant to combat crime. If instead they're meant to lock away large portions of the population from everyone else and to make profit off of it, prisons are actually a big success. Prison is a big industry. 2003, it raked in $185 billion in tax dollars and employed 2.4 million people. And so, if you stop the incarceration binge, one of the things that you're going to have to do is shift people to a different industry. Because the prison industrial complex employs 2.4 million people. And if you suddenly stop just throwing people behind bars like crazy, like we are, then you're not going to need that many people working in the prison industrial complex. So you're going to have to see some kind of industrial shift where labor is then going to find new work somewhere else if we indeed stop the incarceration binge. Now, we often hear when asked why the crime rate in the United States is so much higher than it is in other industrialized nations, we don't hear things like the brutalization effect. We don't hear things like the war on drugs, that our crime rates didn't used to be so high. There are three common excuses that we do here, though, and they don't work. They're demonstrably false excuses. The first one, we're too soft on crime. You hear this all the time. It's like, oh, they got cable TV and 3 hot meals a day and an exercise gym, and it's amazing. I mean, you know, if you really believe that, if you truly believed that conditions in prison were so like a country club, why don't you go out and get yourself arrested and go to prison? I mean, hell, you just got to sit around and you get 3 hot meals brought to you and everything's wonderful, you know, behind bars, then why don't you do everything in your power to get behind bars? The fact of the matter is that the only places where that's true, where there are prisons that are like that, are the prisons that are set aside specifically for those wealthy people who are powerful and well-connected and get caught doing major crimes. And the crimes are so major that they can't, the Justice Department can't turn a blind eye to them anymore. So, yes, are there country club prisons? Yes. Do the vast majority of Americans go there? No. Only the wealthy, powerful, and well-connected go to those type of prisons. So the argument that we're too soft, if you want to say we're too soft on corporate crime, yeah, that's an argument that has some empirical evidence to back it up, as we've discussed. But here's some other things to consider, just in general, how we're not so soft. We're the only industrialized country that still has the death penalty, as I mentioned already. We're far more likely to pass the sentence of life with no possibility of parole than any other industrialized nation. And we beat the